Hello and welcome to this video. If we look at the history of jazz, it's quite interesting to see that if we think of jazz starting off in 1910, which is a nice round number to start off with, when we study jazz history, that history starts to become very vague around about 1970. So we are literally looking at around about 60 years of jazz history. From 1970 onwards, jazz seems to fracture into all sorts of different substreams and different genres. And there's an argument as to what is jazz and what isn't jazz. And so this part of that jazz history, which now we are looking at 50 years of history, 54 years, in fact, from 1970 onwards. It's very interesting to see how almost half of the history of jazz has not really been nailed. You read most jazz histories and it starts to become, at that point, the historians tend to say, and then this happened and that happened. It's dealt with very casually, and some of the influences and cultural pressures on jazz don't get discussed that much. Now, one of the things that elevated this channel up a few years ago was when I did a video called Why Do All Modern Jazz Musicians Sound the Same? And this took me on an odyssey where I explored all aspects of jazz history, eventually creating sort of my version of jazz history that didn't necessarily add up with the mainstream view. And that video was quite contentious as well, and I got into all sorts of hot water. That has all calmed down now, and I have no desire to return to the more contentious aspects of my appraisal of jazz history. But I do think I would like to cover the history from 1970 on and try and look at some of the stuff that was going on at that time. Now, the 1960s is a very interesting period for jazz because the fracturing that we start to see happens there. Now, I think when we discuss the history of jazz, one thing that we don't take into account often is the commercial influences on jazz. So jazz is here, like every single genre and art form, because at some point in history it was popular. Jazz emerged sort of in New Orleans, possibly in the 1890s. It grew, it gained momentum, and the first jazz recording was the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. That record sold 1 million copies. It was a hit. And of course, the burgeoning recorded music industry that was just emerging at that time jumped on it. And throughout the 1920s, we saw more and more releases coming from the jazz genre. But at that time, that genre also crossed over into blues, so is Bessie Smith jazz or was she blues? And even some of the jazz musicians cropped up on country recordings and folk recordings. If we look at a lot of Louis Armstrong's early recordings, there's vocals on them, there were songs. And that development was really, the momentum for that really came from the commercial rewards that were on offer to anybody who got a good jazz record out. And of course, when we look at the 1920s, it's been called the jazz age. That sound is synonymous with what we see as the sort of move from an almost like Victorian cultural epoch to what we could call modernism. Now, one of the things that never gets mentioned is that when things become more successful, they need to get bigger. And so the concerts that you can do in a club with a jazz group are different to trying to fill a big dance hall or even a theatre. And so what you see is the evolution of the big band, and the big band has a power that enables you to play to more people. And in this case, play to people who are dancing. Jazz is dance music. Jazz is fun music. It's popular music. And by the 1930s, the swing era was in full swing. I walked right into that one. And so these records sold in their millions. People like Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, and Benny Goodman were the huge pop acts of that era. Of course, the tradition of singing songs carries on. And we see then in the 1940s the emergence of superstars like Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby. And that really lays the groundwork for the commercial popular music industry in the 1950s. And at that point, jazz fractures, and you get this sort of commercial R&B based jazz that then starts to mix with country music and the blues and then electric guitar music and all that type of stuff. And that moves towards, rock and roll, soul, rhythm and blues. And that line runs through into the rock music that becomes the popular music in the 1960s. But jazz takes another route, and jazz becomes elitist at that point. With the advent of the beboppers, jazz is now channeled from being a dance music and popular music to an elitist music. You have to be able to understand the music to appreciate this. You need to sit down and listen. The appreciation of virtuosity becomes far more important than the appreciation of just hedonist fun. Now, the reason why I mentioned all this is because if we see the genre of jazz splitting and going two ways, the popular music forms of the later part of the 20th century do exactly the same things. If we look at the pure hedonist music of rock and roll and doo-wop and all that stuff that's around in the 50s going into the 60s, it creates this new music form. Now, the music form of the 60s is basically, we could call it youth music because that covers the whole range. And people want to party, they want to have fun. But what we see in the 1960s is that youth movement, they want change in the same way the youth movement in the 1920s wants change. And so they start looking around for things that are more sophisticated, that express how they feel. And the idea of freedom of expression itself becomes very important. With the 1960s comes this idea of the civil rights movement, of searching out alternative voices. And jazz reacts like that by reacting against the very straitjacket of bebop. A jazz musician with a good ear could practice and get into a swing band. It's the soloing required there is simpler than what the beboppers did. Of course, that generation deliberately created these difficult chord changes and blinding speed and double time phrasing to alienate the generation before. But by the 1960s, those strictures have become a straitjacket. And we see the emergence of free jazz. And free jazz is much more, in the 1960s at least, about really championing freedom of expression and almost expressing some sort of spiritual enlightenment and at the same time some sort of anger and rage. The rage of the black community in America suddenly turning around and trying to find a voice that they could shout their situation. Now, free jazz is interesting because with the advent of rock music and electronics and electric guitar, free jazz offers a sort of almost democratized way of improvising, right? The pioneers of free jazz were virtuoso jazz musicians, but the rock musicians in the 60s could listen to stuff like that and they could go, I wonder if we can sort of emulate that with our electric guitars. And so the sophistication of rock music that emerges in the 60s is allied to bringing in different influences from jazz, which has now become an elitist, rarefied form, but also a music of rebellion, and taken from classical music. And we see the genres quickly emerge by the 70s of things like progressive rock and jazz fusion, the stuff that we champion on this channel. Now, the troublesome thing here is rock musicians are borrowing from jazz. Jazz is being used as an inspiration, and it's been used for an inspiration in a number of different ways. If we listen to something like Machine Gun by Jimi Hendrix, we can see that Jimi Hendrix, as well as playing the blues, is also, exploring modal ideas and ideas that have come out of John Coltrane. Whereas if we think of Jimi Hendrix doing the Star Spangled Banner, we see that as almost like an expression of rebellion, and it seems to be pulling from free jazz. So these influences are coming in, and these jazz influences are creating rock music. You could easily argue at this point, if you wanted to, that the history of jazz is the movement from the free jazz of the 70s to the jazz rock. Sorry, the free jazz of the 60s with the jazz rock of the 70s. We could see all the forms that emerge in rock music, as opposed to rock and roll and pop music, as being an arm of jazz. Okay, if we look at soul, R&B, funk, if we look at ska and reggae, if we look at progressive rock and jazz rock fusion, they owe again a huge debt to jazz. These forms came out of jazz in the 50s, as I described, and then they take from jazz again. Jazz is like a great big spine running down the center of music history in the 20th century. And so the only way we can look at jazz history is by trying to exclude all this stuff that we don't want to call jazz. And this stuff is multi-layered. Okay? So when we listen to the jazz rock fusion of Tony Williams' lifetime, this really does sound like sort of a time no changes free jazz, but with electric instruments. They're still swinging and they're still playing out. No one is going to accuse Tony Williams' lifetime as being pop music. But when we look at bands like Blood, Sweat and Tears in Chicago, is that jazz? Is Earth, Wind and Fire jazz? And by the same token, when we start to look at, say, Cream, did Jimi Hendrix experience Led Zeppelin? Is this jazz or is it not jazz? And of course, the ground which is really debated is the world of jazz rock. It has jazz in the title, but do we class jazz rock as being the main direction of jazz in 1970s, or do we push it to the side as Ken Burns did in his jazz documentary and go, that stuff's going on and it's a different thing altogether? And then he tries to plot the sort of saving of proper jazz throughout the 1970s, really pointed at Dexter Gordon as keeping the little flame, fanning the little flame and breathing, life into it to keep the eternal flame of jazz alive through the 1970s. Now, this is a troublesome way of looking at jazz. If we were to accept that jazz rock is the actual natural extension of jazz, the problem is then how far are we going to go down that route? Is Tony Williams' lifetime, is that jazz? Probably, yeah. Marvin Orchestra, I don't know. Return to Forever, I really don't know. Headhunters, Herbie Hancock. Earth, Wind and Fire. The Brothers Johnson. Michael Jackson. Where do we stop? And then we see in the late 70s the emergence of rap and hip hop. And that has its roots in the Last Poets. Again, another aspect of jazz. And hip hop operates in exactly the same way as jazz, except the language of improvisation has changed. Rather than improvising with harmony and notes, it takes the rhythms of bebop, it takes the groove of jazz, and it brings in the improvisation around words. And so I have felt for many years that hip hop should be seen as the natural extension of jazz. Now, we could be arguing around this and say, well, does it matter? The problem is that if you look in a jazz history book, it obviously does not consider the history of hip hop as being the natural extension of jazz. The blues is a very interesting genre as well, because the blues is running hand in hand with jazz, and the development of heavy metal by Black Sabbath in the late 1960s and the whole history of that, we could see that blues naturally runs into heavy rock music and heavy metal. And there's a certain point where you have to draw the line. You know, we could obviously hear the blues influences in, say, Fleetwood Mac, but are there blues influences in Metallica? Are there blues influences in Soundgarden? Are there blues influences in Napalm Death or Bon Jovi? You see, the whole thing is that creative musicians are taking what's gone before and they are morphing it into new things, and we're moving forward. And so the history of jazz is hard to track, and that's what this video is really about, is trying to explain some of the troublesome spots. Now, jazz rock as a very creative form has a lifespan, I would say, from 1971 to 1976. And we could go in there and find records that sold heavy numbers, but has an approach to improvisation that is a sophisticated enough to be classed as jazz, just in terms of intellectual weight and creative approaches, without a doubt. But that bubble burst, you know, the jazz rock bubble burst in 1976, and this sort of anathema to jazz rock is disco. Disco comes and, you know, pops its head up in the mid 70s, and it is actually created outside some of the aspects of jazz rock. And suddenly people like Herbie Hancock are having crossover hits. They're making lots of money and they're being played in nightclubs. And we are back to that situation that we had in the 1930s. Jazz becomes dance music again. Now, we are definitely going to class the big band jazz groups of the 1930s as jazz. But are we going to class bands like, you know, Kool and the Gang or Earth, Wind and Fire as jazz? I mean, it looks like a jazz group to me. We've got a horn section, we've got saxophone solos, we've got a groove, you know, we've got songs about having fun and all that type of stuff. Or is it too frivolous to be jazz? In other words, jazz fractures. Like I said, jazz fractures in 1970. And so what the establishment do is they make this thing goes, where's the pure jazz at that point? We need to make jazz a pure thing. And you start to see arguments like, oh, I know these people are improvising, but it's not at the same level as jazz musicians improvise. As though Big Spiderbeck was playing at the same level as Charlie Parker, who was playing at the same level as Ornette Coleman. None of this makes sense, right? These are the inherent problems. The established idea in jazz history was that jazz rock went on. Some of it's quite good, but most of it's just too commercial, and we discount it. And certain musicians kept jazz alive, a lot of the old guard. Now, this really is counter to how we should think about jazz. Who are the new jazz musicians who emerged in the 1970s? How are you going to list them without coming up with people like Pat Metheny and Jaco Pastorius, or, you know, or Al Di Meola, you know, or John Scofield? How are you going to, you know, how are you going to class a musician like Michael Brecker, perhaps the greatest saxophone improviser of the last 50 years? He's obviously not just jazz, but he's a giant of jazz. But are we going to class the Brecker brothers? So what happens is this teasing out of this line of jazz, which then gains momentum in the 1980s with the emergence of the Young Lions. These are the musicians that then came in and moved back to a much more traditional idea of what jazz should be. Now, I found this troublesome. I start at that point. I become interested in jazz. My dad had played me jazz since I was a kid, but no, then I got into heavy rock, heavy metal. Then suddenly Wynton Marsalis emerges, and I was blown away by Wynton Marsalis in the 1980s, and I bought those albums. And I remember thinking, this is proper music. I might like my prog and jazz fusion more, but this guy really plays proper jazz. And I had the feeling that Wynton was proper jazz. But his dislike of fusion, his criticisms of Miles Davis at the time, irked me. And I started to get quite annoyed that this division was going on. And then on top of that, the jazz rock and jazz fusion in the 1970s really becomes commercial. And you do start to wonder whether these albums could, you know, so Rocket by Herbie Hancock, is that a jazz album? You know, I don't think there's any improvisation on there. Herbie Hancock does a synth solo that lasts for about 4 bars. It's just a lick. You know, there's probably more improvisation in, I don't know, a Duran Duran album, a Duran Duran song, you know. So this return to the conservatism of the 1980s is very interesting because, in a way, there's an argument that you should not class that as jazz, and that should be seen as the movement to trad jazz that happened in the 1940s and 1950s. That emerged where people were trying to play traditional jazz, New Orleans jazz, as accurately as they possibly could. And the same thing happens in the 1980s, where certain musicians are trying to play hard bop um, as accurately as they could. Now, what's interesting to me, and this never gets discussed, is if we do go and stick a Winter Marsalis album on from the early 80s and listen to what they're doing, it's not exactly like Art Blakey or John Coltrane or Ornette Coleman. There is the influence of jazz rock in there. The drumming is more muscular. It's taken from Jack DeJohnette and Elvin Jones, but it's more powerful, and the soloing has a much more direct influence from. It's like a meatiness. There's a rockiness to it. There's an adherence to time a lot more. The time is more nailed and locked. That has happened in jazz as we've gone on. I've just got Lewis Cole's new album, which is called Nothing, I think. It's an absolute work of art. I would say this is the highest music out there at the moment. I've got it in the car. It's absolutely incredible. I gave it a good review, but listening to it over and over again, the guy is pioneering. And again, tons of songs, tons of highly orchestrated stuff. Is this jazz? There's moments where it is without a doubt jazz. But if we look at jazz improvisation, even from those conservative roots of Wynton Marsalis, and we track that through, we can see that the sort of mathematical spacing, the rigidity of time has got tighter and tighter. This has been influenced by the jazz rock musicians, then it's been influenced by dance music, and then things like drum and bass in hip hop, and now it's been influenced by sort of computer-based music. And all the solos on the Lewis Cole album, which I absolutely love, are just tirades of very mathematical 16th notes or 16th note triplets. It almost sounds like a computer has created these things. It's an incredible display of virtuosity. But what is important is the mathematical density. All this is directly influenced by what's going on in contemporary pop music. So in a way, those Wynton Marsalis albums in the early 80s have that influence. You cannot get away from it. Movements in the 1980s like M-Bass, Steve Coleman's concepts, stuff that's being pioneered, that's come out of free jazz, but combining it with hip hop and combining it with punk, things that's the stuff that Material was doing, it, this sort of heavy metal approach to free jazz that bands like Last Exit are doing, the emergence in the 70s and 80s of the sort of European free jazz, which is much more rarefied and much less about rebellion and a lot more about creating sort of abstract spaces. And then we could throw into that some of the electronic improvisation that emerges with groups like Tangerine Dream, which has now gone on. And now we have genres like, there's a whole genre of modular synth. Now, what is modular synth? It's improvised, you create it on the spot, but it's also rigidity. It's rigid because the rigidity comes from the creation of structure through modules, right? The use of sampling, the use of sequencing, all these things are out there. The history of jazz from 1970 is almost impossible to nail. And any attempt at it is usually cursory. It's like, well, jazz rock came a lot and that was quite successful and people went down and it got too commercial. But, you know, people like Wynton Marsalis kept it alive and that's developed into the contemporary artists now. And if you listen to contemporary jazz artists, I'm not saying fusion artists, I'm saying jazz artists, go and listen to them and find out how many of them are actually swinging now. Swing has diminished. The very fruitiness that created jazz in the first place, the thing that made those big bands popular, has gone from jazz. It exists elsewhere. So there's another aspect of this that I would like to mention. In America, throughout the 1960s, jazz is reflecting the sort of very avant-garde experimental forms that exist right on the edge of this music. And that is being funded by government funding. They're putting their money into trying to create new forms of art. The conservatism that comes in with Reagan in the 1980s changes with the way that funding goes. And there's a movement to funding things which are much more based upon American history. And we get the idea from identity politics that we should be funding underprivileged groups. And so the evolution of jazz as Black American classical music emerges with Winton because it's so fundable. It's very easy to sit up a big band and explore the music of the past, to champion what has now been seen as black music, right? Jazz is been created by African Americans. I've got into the weeds of this so much, so I just want to simplify this a little bit. Let us just say for now, is the idea of jazz as black music in 1930 is completely different to this idea of jazz as black music in the 1980s, 1990s up until now. There is now sort of a hallowed respect. Jazz was once seen as being something that other. It was the other. It was taboo. And I like that. I like the danger of it. But now jazz is seen as something that we must go, this is very, very important. Let's talk about it in a hush voice, bring everybody in, all the rich people come in, buy expensive ticket. Let's sit down and let's hear these gentlemen explore the ideas of Duke Ellington. That's, it has become rarefied. And that hasn't just happened. It's down to funding. If that funding wasn't there, it wouldn't have happened. And jazz may well have died. When we look at the National Endowment of the Arts in America, the whole idea, and which seems worthy, is to keep this music form alive because it's now a museum piece. It's something that needs to be respected. It's something that needs to be cherished and nurtured. It needs to be, packaged up and placed onto the very clean plinth in the Museum of American History and needs to be given the respect that's due. And all of this, in a way, is counter to the spirit of jazz. Now, I believe that the whole key to understanding the history of jazz is to understand recording. As soon as recording emerged, and as soon as people thought, why don't we go and record these jazz musicians that didn't have a name? The recording was able to capture groove and improvisation, and that's very, very important. And the spirit of that still exists in popular music, although it may be someone with a sampler tapping out and just trying to find a groove that works. And so on this video, I've really tried to just talk about some of the problems that are inherent in studying jazz history. I do want to return back to looking at jazz history again, but I really want to explore what's been going on more since 1970 because it's so important for this channel. We will go into depth about Weather Report or the Mavish Orchestra, or even the improvisations that come out of bands like Soft Machine and Brand X or Alan Holdsworth. And for me, perhaps the greatest jazz musician of the last 50 years is Alan Holdsworth. And yet it's very easy for him to just have a cursory mention or no mention at all in a jazz encyclopedia. This is really strange because I promise you, if you go into a jazz college, and I haven't even mentioned them because jazz colleges emerged in the 60s and 70s and now they're a thing. And now the only people that can really access jazz education are rich people who can fund their way through. That jazz has moved from being the music of the street, of the underprivileged, to being the music of the elites. All this stuff is troublesome. Do we want jazz to stay around? Would it be best just to scrap the concept and just get on with it? Do we want bands playing in these old-fashioned styles to keep them alive? Is it still nice to be able to do, walk down and hear a big band? I want to hear a big band. I want to hear people playing the bebop style. I'd like to hear some gypsy jazz. I love all these forms of music. And is there anything wrong with someone studying it and playing it in the same way a classical musician might study Bach or Brahms and learn how to play that? Does it really matter? Why am I going on about it? Is it really that important? Can't you just let it be? Can't we just move away from it? Now, my worry with that is will we forget what went on in the realms of prog and jazz rock because nobody wants these forms in their history books unless they write in the history book of jazz rock? If you're a musician working today, your lineage will come out of musicians from the progressive rock genre, but more than anything else, from the jazz rock genre. I'm a drummer. If you put drummers in a room, they start to talk about Billy Cobham, Tony Williams, Steve Gadd, Dave Weckl, Vinnie Colaiuta. Right, that is the history of drumming, and every drum history would contain those drummers, and yet we're discounting them from the history. And what happens if we put them into the history? Do we then turn them into museum pieces? History is a troublesome thing. I deal with it daily on this channel. How do I discuss it? How do I approach it? So what are the areas that I would like to get into on this channel? Because this is sort of another introductory video. And once I get, some sort of clickbaity title for it, I'm hoping that, we'll get a lot of views on this. What I've done with this video, I've just come on and addressed the thoughts of jazz history since 1970. I know that within this is the problem with modern jazz. So when we go back to that video where I stated, it wasn't my statement, it was a statement that somebody put on a comment. Why do all modern jazz musicians sound the same? Now, I don't actually think they do, but I think there's a feeling that they do, and I sort of am empathetic to the feeling. It feels like most jazz musicians are going through the motions, that most jazz musicians have to bow down at the altar of jazz, and they have to do certain things to be jazz musicians. Of course, there's very clever musicians and creative musicians out there that are exploring these ideas, but I do think this video is fundamentally addressing this idea, and I'm trying to open it up and start talking about it from a different angle. In my big exploration of the history of jazz since 1970, after I stated that all modern jazz musicians sound the same, and the whole jazz world seemed to get upset by it, and I had lots of feedback, and I had lots of reaction videos and people saying, why is this British person talking about this? He shouldn't talk about jazz, and all this really weird stuff. One of the things that really emerged for me was in the same way with progressive rock, that the prog rockers know the form is dead in 1974, before punk comes along. As Jason Marsalis pointed out brilliantly in an interview that I did with him, that the jazz rock musicians did the same. By the late 70s, early 80s, your Herbie Hancocks, your John McLaughlins, your Chick Coreas, all those guys were returning to something that was more traditional. In terms of Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock, it was just to go back to playing straight jazz, the sort of jazz that they've been playing in the 1960s. People like Al Di Meola turned to a much more sort of flamenco-based style. Some people returned to an acoustic style. It's so complex, and I'm just scratching the surface. But I think what has been lost is because the history has to blow on the embers of jazz that was dying in the 1970s and bring it back alive. What's happened is we have fixated our education system not on the whole history, right? If you were teaching popular music studies or rock music, you're going to look at Led Zeppelin, but you're also going to look at Linkin Park, and you're even going to look at Arctic Monkeys and dance music and electronic music and grime. You're going to study that. You're not going to just go, let's just ignore it from this point on. But with jazz, that's precisely what happens. Nobody studies New Orleans jazz. Nobody really looks at big band jazz in terms of the popular stuff. They're much more inclined to look at someone like Duke Ellington. They do look at the beboppers. They do look at the hard boppers. And to some extent, there's a little bit of thought that goes around about modal jazz. And that is it. The jazz education studies a very narrow band of jazz history. It chooses that group thing. That's it. We're not going to look at that. We're not going to look at that. And so, as Martin Miller said on an interview on here, You know, when he turned up at jazz college and walked in with his electric guitar, they said, you know, you're here to improvise, you can do whatever you want. So he puts his chorus pedal onto the floor and plugs in, and they're like, what are you doing? You've got a chorus pedal. Straight off, we know where we're at. We know what we could do. Play like Wes Montgomery or Charlie Christian, or maybe a little bit like Pat Martino, maybe a touch of Pat Metheny and John Schofield, but no further. We don't want Greg Howe here. You know, it's these unconscious demarcations. Now, people here call it gatekeeping, and it is gatekeeping, but there is a structure behind it. And I'm hoping revisiting this with what I know, because you might say, why are you going back to this? It's because I love jazz. I study the history all the time. And I feel by doing this channel, I've actually got to a point where I've got a much wiser approach than a couple of years ago when I decided to put a video out of me saying, you know, all jazz sounds the same. Now, I'm probably going to use a similar title for this because I think that's the button I need to press. But I'm hoping here, by looking at the history of jazz, we can see how, looking at the funding and the history, how that has affected jazz education. And now we have, especially with the internet and YouTube, a situation where you have musicians just blasting out sort of cool licks that they've practiced on Instagram and getting a name, whilst other people will tell you how to sound like the cliched jazz of 60 years ago, and trying to con musicians into that is what they should learn. Whereas, you know, a modern jazz musician may actually unlock the future for them by actually going back to Bix Beiderbecke, you know, or going back to Lester Young. I grew up listening to these people, going back to Coleman Hawkins, listening to what they're doing, the fruitiness of Johnny Hodges' sound, because we lack that in jazz, don't we? We lack the fruitiness, we lack the expression, we lack the drama, we lack the sweeps and bobs and abstract sounds of early jazz. I'm not saying we're going to throw it all away. I'm saying we've got to widen our remit in terms of what we're looking at. I think I've got to the end of this video now. I think I've said what I wanted to say for now, and I'm going to come back and revisit. Let's see how this goes down. Anyway, if you did like this video, please put a like on it. If you want to see some more like this, subscribe and stick in the comments that you found this interesting, because here I've got a prog audience, I've got a classic rock audience, I've got a bunch of people who create musicians, and I've got a jazz audience, and I want to try and cater for them all if I can. So, you know, subscribe if you want to see more. If you want to support me in what I'm doing, I have a Patreon and the link is down below. I also have a PayPal tip jar, and now there's a new link for anyone who wants to support this incredible charity, the Jellyman's Heritage Arts Charity, that I am now working within, and there's a link to support that charity, and that money will go to not just supporting me, but will be supporting young creative people in this area that I want to reach out to. I think I'm done. I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.